Welcome everyone to the first Intergen session of this year. Intergen sessions are a program of the 50% along with the Club of Rome that has been running for the last year or so. And we've had some amazing experiences along with some Club of Rome members and people that are leading on their fields, learning a lot and sharing especially a lot of motivation and creativity and inspiration. So today we have as our speaker to Sandrine Dixson-Declève. Sandrine is an international and European climate, energy, sustainable development, sustainable finance, complex system thought leader. She's currently the co-president of the Club of Rome and divides her time between lecturing, facilitating difficult conversations, and advisory work. She currently chairs the European Commission Expert Group on Economic and Societal Impact of Research and Innovation and sits on the European Commission's Sustainable Finance Platform. Sandrine, it's a great pleasure and honor to us to have you here today. So please, whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Matthias, and thanks to you and Nolita for inviting me in for these incredible sessions. It's really an honor. And I've decided to change my background on my screen because I think that it's very relevant to the conversation that we're having, even though this was last year's very clear focus around the 50th anniversary of the Club of Rome. What you wanted me to speak about today, and I'm really honored to be able to speak about, was how do we look at leadership for systems transformation? And what does that look like in the 21st century? And what I wanted to do was bring to you some of my personal experience, in particular recent experiences working with the club, and how we're really trying to shift systems thinking across different policy arenas and push for new policy, for new leadership in this area in order to really match the 21st century challenges that are before us. Next slide, please, Nolita. So as I was indicating, it was last year the 50th anniversary of the Limits to Growth. The Limits to Growth, which is the seminal report of the Club of Rome. And why was it so important? For many of us who have grown up with the Limits to Growth, and even for those who didn't know about the limits, what we realized was that the messages in the Limits to Growth, which demonstrated that with continued population growth, with a continued extractive economy, and without taking into consideration our relationship either with poverty, inequity, or between North and South, which we try not to talk about when we speak about the South, we typically say most of the world. We felt that it was really important at this time to mark this seminal report. Now, I've put forward two of the key important quotes that are going to set the stage for the conversation that we're going to have. If you look at the Limits to Growth, even in 1972, we already were talking about this being a challenge for our generation. Just think about it. In 1972, there were about 3.5 billion people. Now we've doubled in population. And so it's interesting to see that we were already talking about the greatest effect on that generation. You could just take out the Limits to Growth 1972 and we'd be talking about exactly the same thing today. It just demonstrates how little has changed in the last 50 years. And the big difference is now we are what we call a full world of above 7 billion and moving towards even more people on this planet. We've gone beyond the planetary boundaries and we're running out of time. The other key quote that I wanted to bring in is one of the esteemed authors of the Limits to Growth is Donella Meadows. And Donella Meadows is the real, I'd say, the queen of systems thinking, the mother of systems thinking. And what she did as she continued her journey in thinking about systems was start to talk about key leverage points, places within a complex economy, a corporation, an economy, a living body, a city, an ecosystem, a political framework, where a small shift can actually produce big changes in everything. And so keep those two quotes in mind as we move forward in this presentation. Next slide, please. Because when we start to think about systems thinking and the way in which we start to really translate this into transformational change, It is in particular when you look at transformation within the economy and within our finance system, within our geopolitics and political economy, you see that we need to move from neoliberal linear thinking into circular or even exponential S-curves, but a variety of different, more holistic thinking approaches that take into consideration compound effects, that take into consideration integrated solutions, networks, and most importantly, emerging from emergency. Next slide, please. So that means we need to understand interconnected global instabilities and systems transformation in crisis, because what we're now saying in the conversations that we're having continuously with leaders is we are in the midst of a polycrisis, but this is not going to be the first time. We will see a continuum of having to plan through chaos, of having to think through our systems, both the fact that they're broken, but also in whatever we create, we need to build in resilience. So in the social system, we need to address socioeconomic inequality, the growing elderly population and demographic shifts, sense-making disrupted by social media, and economic insecurity. In our economic system, we need to look at mass unemployment or total shifts in employment and what those kind of new skill sets, what is the work of the future? What is the job of the future? Endemic economic insecurity, short-termism and profiteering, trade wars and debt cancellation, all of these key issues that are now actually coming out in a variety of different ways, even in multilateral development organizations. We need to look at the global commons, the pandemic, the climate tipping points, the species extinction and biodiversity loss, and think through what the multidisciplinary aspects are in order to get the solutions that we need. And then we need to address the political system, the growing polarization and distrust, the rise of nationalism and authoritarian regimes, the pullback from international cooperation, migration, including from climate change, and short-term political cycles. Next slide, please. What is coming forward continuously as we think about transformational change is that we need to look at a variety of disruptive forces. There is an obvious focus on technological disruption, and this technocratic and technological focus is not the only way we are going to get out of the mess that the population, that all of us have created. We have to address market forces and the fact that actually, again, capitalistic systems and the market as we know it is broken. We have to address political progress and what that actually means, both in terms of bottom-up and top-down political processes. And we have to address mass movements and the great growing concerns of the activist communities, the youth community, that actually the current systems that we have do not reflect the needs of people, planet, and prosperity. So what we're seeing is that the 2020s will see the fastest economic transition in history, and for that we need real leadership. What is interesting is already in the limits to growth, we saw through the scenario development of the limits, both by those MIT professors and experts that were commissioned to put forward the limits to growth, that actually this was going to be where we would see the greatest tipping points at this time right now in the 2020s. But what they didn't predict at that time was that we would need to get to zero carbon, zero loss of nature, zero poverty, and zero pandemics at the same time. Next slide, please. So this calls for talking about the key elephant in the room, something that we speak about a lot at the Club of Rome, and something that we are trying now to very much pull in the leadership so they understand that we need a new leadership. One, to address not only supply side and technological solutions, but to address, obviously, the need to address demand side solutions, as well as address poverty, inequality, biodiversity loss. That our inherent wastefulness and extractive economy is not going to enable us to live within the planetary boundaries or enable us actually to thrive. That we actually need to think through the essential questions of responsibility and equity. Next slide, please. This means that the current neo-colonial model, the rich world, basically is being fueled by raw materials from elsewhere on the planet. And we need to address this. in a variety of different ways, whether it is through the way in which we enhance and we look at our trade, the way in which we look at the integration between different economies, our knowledge exchange, not just this continuous focus around the exploitation that we see between different economies, and in particular, as I said, between high-income economies and low-income countries. What we are seeing, though, is that the shift from just a neo-colonial model into a model where also now some countries in the South, in particular, upper middle income countries, for example, China, who is also being fueled and working with other countries across the South and creating unholy dependencies in the same way. So these unholy dependencies need to be completely shifted. And what's interesting is that if we look at what happened during COVID, is the value chain disruption that we saw very clearly at that time, where we saw that our dependencies, and we're seeing it through the Ukrainian war, are creating real resilience issues across our systems, whether it be the food system, whether it be our materials dependencies, or whether it be our energy dependencies. Next slide, please. So this is why we need transformational economics for the 21st century. And we also need transformational finance for the 21st century, and what we call change finance. Both need to meet the needs of all within planetary boundaries. They need to meet basic human needs to ensure dignity. They need to account for social and environmental risk within the financial and the economic decision-making. If you look at the current economy, which is over-financialized, totally disconnected actually from the needs of people, you can see that, for example, shareholder value is the only value that drives the economy today in most cases. This means that the short-termism and the shareholder value determinants within the over-financialization of the economy, that you could actually fire up to 10,000, 20,000 people, and actually shareholder value goes up, whereas unemployment goes up, and that's not taken into account in the economy. So we need to very much expand our understanding of the social and environmental risk of the current systems that we have before us, expand our perspective of public goods and the role of the state, and socialize the rewards of environmental and social commons, correct the inequity between high and low income countries created by international finance and trade systems, and fundamentally increase the agency of women and workers to drive the direction of the economy. This is actually being formulated in a series of models that are being considered today, and that's where it gets exciting. The well-being economy model that's been taken over now by 5 different economies, and which are being looked at even in larger economies like Canada. The mission economies that have been promoted predominantly by Europe, where you focus on a particular mission and you drive towards that mission, towards transformational change, which actually is now being discussed with other countries across the globe. Green growth, post-growth, donut economics, and beyond GDP. And in fact, in Europe next May, this coming May, there will be the largest Beyond Growth conference ever held between, or with actually, parliamentarians from the right and the left and the center coming together to unpack what a new economy needs and what types of indicators we should be putting in place in Europe. Next slide, please. But we can see that this conversation is happening beyond Europe. And that's what I said, that we've got now well-being economics that have been actually adopted by 5 countries, 3 of which are in Europe: Finland, Iceland, Scotland, and Wales, so 4 of them. New Zealand, which also has put forward its well-being economy model, and we very much hope that actually after now the stepping down of Jacinta Ahern and also of Nicola Sturgeon, that these models will continue. That is a risk. But what's interesting with these models is the fact that you see the juxtaposition and the focus on economic indicators alongside societal indicators and environmental indicators. And this is where we really could, if we hold leaders accountable, start to see deep transformation in the way in which nations engage with the economy and the way in which they start to direct environmental and social change within their economies. Next slide, please. So I fundamentally believe this is a unique moment in time. we've got the shock of the global pandemic, which has forced us to reflect on what really matters. And on the European continent, obviously, there is also the shock of the Ukrainian invasion, which is having a double whammy effect, in addition to climate change. We have the 7 years counting to avoid the worst impacts of climate crisis and the continued polycrises and the compound effects of these crises. So what we call this decade of action. But in addition, what's interesting is that in tapping in the consciousness of people globally, 74% of people in G20 countries want transformation towards well-being economies. Coming out of COVID, they realized the importance of the care economy. They realized the importance of what was most essential to have actual access to hospitalization, access to social services, access to basic essentials like food, energy, and water. Next slide, please. So this is also why we've developed the Earth for All model, based again on the limits to growth. And remember, the initial thinking around the limits to growth, population growth linked to the planetary boundaries and the impact of population growth on a finite planet, extractive economy. And what we wanted to do with this new model was to assess and quantify the economic socio-biosystem dynamics and the impacts of extraordinary action in 5 key areas. This was done actually with what we call our Transformational Economics Commission. And the whole idea was that through thinking through all of the interrelated issues that we see today, the stress points, trying to find a pathway to change. That pathway to change pointed us towards these 5 core turnarounds: poverty, empowerment, equality, energy, and food. Next slide, please. And what you see is that we addressed those 5, and we looked at 2 key scenarios. The too little, too late scenario, which is the scenario today, and which really indicates that actually poverty reaches zero only around 2100. Remember the graph that I showed around the social tipping points. If we don't deal with poverty far before 2100, we will have continued social tension. And that could be even greater than climate change, and even aggravated by climate change and further conflicts. The social tensions that continue to rise will mean that well-being will fall. So the way in which we now have seen a continued disruption and disconnect between well-being and wealth generation, it will only continue to get worse. And then from an environmental and human footprint perspective, the global average temperature will reach 2.5. We already know that that is catastrophic, and that's just a minimum. So the human footprint will be felt even more. Next slide, please. So as we see the global well-being is declining, in the too little, too late scenario, the social tension just becomes exponential and incredibly explosive. Next slide, please. That's why you need the giant leap scenario. In this case, poverty reaches zero around 2050. What we're calling for is that across the globe, every citizen has $15,000 per annum as a salary, but we also bring in the need for a universal basic dividend, which I don't have time to get into, but we are very much pushing and having conversations, even in the United States, in some ways, to just come in with a minimum wage, which would already enable most of even the US population to hit these levels. Well-being rises and temperature stabilizes at below 2 degrees. Next slide, please. As we see that global well-being is declining, what we do see is a reversal of that trend if we're able to bring in the well-being giant leap scenario. And for us, that is the type of leadership that we need. Going back to the economic models, if we want to enable people, planet, and prosperity to be equal and to be hit in the next century, then we need to have that global well-being index going up. Next slide, please. And this is where it becomes really interesting. And this is where we have conversations continuously around how do you actually truly transform for the long term in the short term? Because what we're starting to see already now is the feedback loops are only aggravating. Look at Europe in terms of energy poverty. Look at the impacts that we see on the world's most vulnerable in terms of climate change. So everything is a function of inequality and poverty, and also becomes aggravated because of inequality and poverty. Recent conversations with leaders have really focused on this very point, because what it does is it creates instability. It starts to create a backlash in terms of populism. Populism then means more autocratic, dictatorship type governments. We shift from democracy, we shift from citizen engagement into a totally different type of regime that then would no longer either take into consideration people's needs, nor take into consideration the planetary needs and moving towards a greener and healthier planet. So we need to very much look at how social trust influences the political space and how this really creates transformation. Next slide, please. So these are linked to the key calls to action that we've actually been thinking recently through Earth for All, which is this project that has been led with the Club of Rome and by the Club of Rome, but with other partners. And I think it's interesting to see that this is now, today, where we're really in the midst of putting out messaging around what transformational leadership looks like. It means upgrading and transforming the dominant economic worldview from extractive to regenerative in both monetary and material cycles, and by applying insights from living systems, basically going back to the importance of nature, understanding that we are nature and nature is us, thinking through the way in which nature functions and the wonderful integrated nature of nature that is so important. It also means upgrading and transforming the global financial system. There's a very live conversation, some of you may or may not know, beyond Bretton Woods, which is being looked at through the Bridgetown Initiative, led by Barbados and Mia Motley. A brand new thinking, a real push against the current neo-colonial thinking, looking at debt cancellation, looking at new special drawing rights, looking at totally refocusing the multilateral development banks in really stopping this inequality issue and starting to solve the world's problems going back to basic needs. But also, I think what's very interesting is that we're giving a vision of what the future can look like. These 5 turnarounds basically cost 2 to 4% of GDP per annum. So it is not going to cost the earth, but if we don't do anything, it will cost the earth. Governance by an active and trusted state is needed. That doesn't necessarily mean, again, an autocratic state, but it means a state that takes control when necessary in order to foster the lives and livelihoods of people, planet, and make sure that actually prosperity and wealth is redistributed. It takes bold new funding mechanisms through which high-income countries support the low-income countries. It takes long-term planning rather than short-term decision-making, but it also means short-term levers now that start to create that shift and catalyze that long-term planning. The material consumptions have to decrease and shift, and that actually the shared benefits have to continuously be brought in, the bottom-up participation, citizen assemblies, and local adaptation, because we see increasingly the importance of local communities. And that new economic indicators must be adopted. And look at the way in which we're starting to actually speak about this across different countries, across different regions, is phenomenal. Next slide, please. So I'm going to finish with just a few more slides, because I wanted to bring this in as an important example of how we're starting to get into the mindset of different policymakers and talking about transformational leadership. We've actually come up with the International System Change Compass. And what this compass is doing, and what's so fascinating in the work that I've been doing in trying to work with policymakers on this, is it's placing a value on everything that is most important. It's talking about redefining prosperity. It's talking about redefining natural resource use, redefining progress and maximizing well-being, redefining measures and metrics, measuring the full impact of national consumption and production, understanding that we need to place a value on nature. And of course, that's a very difficult thing to do, as it is to place a value on human life as well. Redefining competitiveness, applying collaborative and mission-oriented methods, redefining the types of incentives that we need to put in place, and understanding that we need to totally shift our consumption patterns. And then we get into the big, hairy shifts, the financial system, the governance system, and what does it mean to be a real leader? How do we start to place ourselves as good ancestors? By building trust across geographies and generations through inclusive and long-term decision-making and thinking through our impact and making sure that we reduce that impact so that we become part of a species rather than the only arrogant species on this planet. Next slide, please. And so I'll finish with this. This thinking is actually starting to be integrated. I have the honor of sitting and chairing a working group, which is called the Economic and Societal Impacts of Research and Innovation. Because of this work, the Directorate General for Research and Innovation of the European Commission has totally shifted its organogram. So its organizational chart and all of its thinking is now based on 3 areas: people, planet, and prosperity, with a horizontal think tank that is continuously thinking through all 3 and how we bring all 3 together. What is interesting is that's a total shift from the original organogram, which was predominantly looking at the traditional neoliberal economic shifts that we could have expected around an extractive economy. In addition, the work that we've been doing has been focusing on how do we protect people, planet, and prosperity? How do we prepare for the next crisis? And then how do we transform society, economy, and regenerate the planet? So how do we move towards a regenerative economy? Next slide, please. And some of the briefs that we've been able to prepare, I mean, these are coming out of the European Commission through our guidance, is looking at how we protect, prepare, and transform Europe when we look at recovery and resilience post-COVID. What does that look like? And most of our suggestions, we're thinking through research and innovation, the role of youth, the role of education, the need to come back to basics, the need to address the care economy, the need to think through how we actually got out of COVID, but make sure that we put in place the right resilience plan for the next pandemic. But we also talked about what does it look like to innovate? And what does it look like to transform industry so that we start talking about an industry that is for people, planet, and prosperity, an industry 5.0, which actually really looks at the new skill sets that we need, which looks at a predominant focus on people and does not just focus on profit and in particular shareholder value. Next slide, please. So I'm going to finish with this, and these are 2 publications that I was lucky enough to contribute to, but that also comes out of this work. One, which is the Polycrisis. This was in the Euractiv actually recently about transformation, which came out of this work from ESIR, this Economic and Societal Impact Research Group, talking very much about the way in which we need to rethink our governance, to build resilience, but to think about a green and human-centric digital transformation, because for the moment there's an obsessive focus on digital transformation at the European level, which is not human-centric, and also at the US level, I should say. That Europe is at a crossroads, that it needs to think through its short-term reactive path, all of the issues that we've seen with regard to energy, which are sending all the wrong signals and perpetuating the neo-colonial model that we've seen, and to really move away into, state-of-the-art human ingenuity, real leadership with new strategies and transformative policies. But by the same token, in Davos, we also released a letter which very much focused on taxing the rich, and that if we valued democracy, we needed to rethink our taxation structures, our financial structures, and really look at a fair wealth and income distribution in order to reduce social tensions. So I'm going to finish with this as a way to show that we're having these very live conversations around what transformative leadership looks like. And I'm really looking forward to having a discussion with you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sandrine. We have an open mic now. If anyone wants to start by doing a question, a comment, everything is welcome. So please just raise your hand and just unmute yourself and go.
While we wait, I actually had a question myself. I was writing very intensely as you were speaking. So thank you so much for sharing. But a question I had was, when you mentioned the call to action on Earth for All, one of the things you mentioned was a trust in state, right? Which brings an assumption that is typically a challenge for younger people to have a trust in the state, because there is often a structural exclusion to the political or economic discussion. Politically, just like the generation from the 60s has proven to not make the types of decisions we hoped that they would make, as we saw in France with the protests on the age of retirement, or as we see like in the African context and the context in the US about like, well, the political divide and the political divide according to age, and also the divide in business according to age. So in your opinion, on this call to action on trust of the state, what are the opportunities for young people to engage in, bolstering this process of like getting a state that can be more trustworthy?
So I think, Nolita, it's a great question, and it's one we're all struggling with. And, we were all young once too. And actually, that's what gets so sad, is that many of us called for the same thing, when we were your age or younger at university. I think the first is, and this is something that everyone underestimates, is the voting power. I mean, we need to start having young people go to the ballot box, because we're seeing across so many countries, because of that lack of trust, right? There's this decision by many young people not to vote anymore. And yet that in the end is in my view, even more catastrophic, because it will not bring in the right governments by totally moving away from the power of the vote. So that would just be one example. But then the other example is the way in which young people are integrated across the decision-making structure. And this is the same with regard to diversity as well, right? I mean, the calls for having more diversity, whether it be in the boardrooms, whether it be in decision-making, is fundamental. More women, more cultures, more sexual diversity, all of this has to be included, not only because it's a quota system, but because the challenges today are so intense and so complex that we need to get as many different thinkers together to get us out of the mess that we've created. What's interesting is this tokenism, and you and I have talked about this, and it's actually come up a lot in conversations that I have with young people. Just the fact that we then have a token youth or a token woman that is on a board, and that's enough, that's sufficient. And I think that's bullshit. That's not sufficient. First of all, just having, and we're doing the same thing, we're siloing now. So what we often do is we see, we're going to create a parallel youth process, rather than, and we need that too, don't get me wrong, but rather than having, like you have tried so hard to do, a real intergenerational dialogue where we can all learn from each other and all bring in the wealth of experience that we have, whatever that experience might be, and the questions and the difficult discussions. Just recently, I was speaking to the cabinet of President von der Leyen at the European Commission. And I bring this up because it was really interesting. It was right on this point. He said, we want to set up another climate youth group. And we want to have an engagement with climate youth. Can you help me get some more? And I said, why would you do that? Why don't you just integrate the youth into the council that I'm a part of and that we're all a part of, and have a proper intergenerational dialogue with very different voices that come together? And it took him aback because he thought he was doing the right thing. But actually, I actually think now it's almost become, and most companies in all the conversations we have at the highest levels want to bring in the youth voice somehow. It's coming in on everything. It comes in their environment, social, and governance, their ESG requirements, their criteria. Youth have to be integrated. But is it the right way? And this is a question I would throw back at all of you, because I would really love to unpack this conversation further. Is it the right way to have these token approaches, or is it better for us to think more of an integrated approach where, and this is where I would put a very strong caveat, where everyone's voice is heard? So not just because the strong white male that's 60 years old and has been around for a long time gets to talk all the time, but actually there is a real sharing of experience. So I think that's another mechanism that we really need to think about. So one is the vote. The other is, how do we ensure real intergenerational governance? And then I think that for those of you who may or may not have read The Good Ancestor, which is a beautiful book by one of our members, Roman Kroshank, and it's really nice. He's also the partner of Kate Rayworth, who wrote Donut Economics. And I think that there he also talks about a real shift in approach. So that then becomes the mindset shift of where we all think of ourselves as becoming a good ancestor, no matter what age we are. And that starts also a very different conversation. I don't know if that was helpful.
It was, thank you.
I also have a remark on this point. First of all, I want to thank you for this brilliant and very insightful presentation. You mentioned a huge amount of things, so it was very complex for me. I'm totally
we'll
different.
We'll share it, because I agree. I went very fast and I wanted to, there was a lot of slides, but I hope they were interesting.
Yeah, totally, absolutely. And I mean, on this topic that we're talking about, so integrating the voice of young people, I think the first question that arose in my mind was, why? Why do we have to do it? Because like a counter argument would be that young people have no experience, and often they don't understand the complexity of the topics they're talking about. I mean, if I had decision power at my work, I would do a disaster, a complete disaster. So why do we have to, right? So my opinion would be that young people have pure energy and pure ideals that kind of get blown off when you grow up and you start seeing the world, and you get a little bit desperate, and you start to get like conservative and say, okay, the world has always been like this, and history has proven this and that, right? But young people, we have these bursts of motivation and energy. So that will be my first guess, but I think that it's deeper than this.
Samuel, I love what you've just brought into the room, because actually this is something that comes up all the time. And I think that there are two aspects of this. One is, it's now become so tokenized, in the same way, by the way, again, that there is a backlash on women and gender diversity, with the same type of arguments, right? That you have to have the competence in order to actually get the position. So in one way, you have to create the opportunity, first of all, in order to truly ensure that there is diversity. I think all of us would agree that competence is fundamental. So this would just be one way to look at this question, because I still believe that the way in which you create an empty chair, for example, in a boardroom, or create an empty chair in a governance situation, forces all of the people in that room to think through, well, who's in that empty chair? Whether it be an Indigenous representative, whether it be a young person, etc. And it immediately creates a mindset shift. So in that sense, it's important. And the process and discussing about it is important. Now, does that mean, however, that anybody and their grandmother can be allowed into a very complex situation where you're going to have to make some deep decisions and that person has absolutely no competence? I would then come to your very provocative point and say probably no. Because, you know, we do have to be serious about this, and we have to take each other seriously. And there's a reason why some of us have a certain experience in a certain area and should be called upon. So I do think we have a very interesting balancing act to do right now, because I see this debate around youth being what the debate around women were already, or, you know, Black Lives Matter and getting more, obviously, Black representatives in the boardroom or in the decision-making room, or more variety of cultures and decision makers and leaders. So it's interesting to see that this is really coming up. And I think that we need to make sure that we give those opportunities to the right people, but also that we're careful that it doesn't get so blown out of proportion that actually could backfire. And then, you know, some decisions might be taken that would not, and I've heard this also within the youth groups sometimes, where there's, you know, a lot of anger and frustration within the youth groups, because they see that sometimes there's a real split. Those that feel that they should be involved in everything, and others who believe that actually their role is to be active in the streets and to really be bottom up rather than top down. And so I think there's a real split in the thinking. I just want to bring in one last point, and I'm seeing all kinds of wonderful hands, so then we'll get to those. A friend of mine in the Netherlands set up a consultancy with elementary school students. And she actually had them consult for CEOs, okay? And it was fascinating, because it comes back to your point around how when we're younger, we're not constrained, we don't have all these issues that everybody's thinking, whether it be making sure they're financially stable or the fact that they might have more mouths to feed or whatever. And it's a thriving consultancy. I mean, there are 6 to 10-year-olds who are basically charged with, if we were going to give you this task, and it's really interesting, if we're going to give you this task, how would you actually accomplish it? And then they go back and they draw and they come up with ideas, and they throw out 5 to 10 different ideas to the board and to the CEO. And then the CEO and the board are forced to at least take one of the ideas. So it's a pact. And in almost, I think 98% of the cases, they've all succeeded. Yeah, Montserrat, I agree. It's fabulous. It's such a great example. So, and I think that should be done in more places as well, because when we talk about youth, it's not just university students. It's all youth with different visions of the world and more creativity. And yeah, it's really exciting. So, Matthias, I don't know if you're taking notes on who's next. I must say I've lost sight now that we've got so many hands.
Yes, it's Theo first. Theo, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Hello, Sandrine. Do you hear me?
Hi,
all
Theo.
right?
Good to see you.
I wanted to ask, because Samuel did a very good point. That is something that I think a lot about, and it's something that is a lot of times brought to me. I live in a university, in a big city, in a place that has a lot of, I would say, like exact way of thinking. As someone studied physics, I studied physics, and we are a little bit cynical about life. And in this kind of environment, what we always say is that our voices are different of the ones that are in politician boards, are in the meeting of CEOs, or a lot of places, but aren't heard. And it's something very difficult, because when you are cynical, your thought is, I can control that, then I give up. And I think that, as you said, something that I studied and I did in another way of my life with social studies, is I see that younger people have a lot of important voices, have a power in their voices, because they think different from us. Even to university studies, that difference in age, 3 to 4 years, and it's totally different way of seeing the world. They have ingenuity. They think of the world without a cynical view. They have hope. They have ideals. And as you said, 6 to 10 years old are changing the way our board meeting is operating.
Yeah.
So my idea was, how do we incorporate an integral way of seeing youth into a board meeting? Because as you said, we can do a parallel board when all the youth discusses, because then the discussion will like drain out. And the people that they see as more, I don't know, well-established or something like that will dominate. Here in Argentina, we have a lot of young politicians that take up, I will say, like tokenize and are told what to say. And that is exactly the opposite of what we want. We want the youth to be representative integrally. How do we do that? I know that it's a very, very, very big challenge, and I think that is something that is being discussed all the time. But that is the idea I want to bring up. How do we integrate youth integrally without doing a parallel board when all the bosses are going to go into one paper that maybe is read by the board?
Yeah, yeah. No, very good question. Hold on just a second. You going? Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a really tough one, huh? And it makes me think of a few things. I mean, you know, the best thing about these 6 to 10-year-olds is that they remind those in the boardroom that they were young once. And so it's creating that catalyst, right, of that mindset shift, which I think is so fundamental. This integrity, you know, when you study shamanism or when you work with shamans, they often tell you to embrace your worst enemy. And it's counterintuitive, right? Because I remember I did a shaman session when actually George Bush was potentially going to be elected. And we were told to send him all of our wisdom and our love in order to make sure that if he was elected, he would actually listen. Well, in the end, he was better than Trump, right? But the fact is that it is totally counterintuitive, and yet it is part of what needs to be discussed as well, which is that the more we have cynicism and the more we have anger and frustration without trying to appeal to the others' pain points, deep frustration, which we may not know about, I think that that's part of transformative leadership. And one of the key conversations, for example, that we're now having across with different leaders, Maya Gopal, who has been actually ostracized in Germany because she's shaking up the entire economic conversation, and she's a member of the club. And she and I have been having a conversation. How do we get to the core of the right-wing movement? How do we actually really move those people that we would not necessarily call our friends? Because they are the ones that don't have the integrity, right? They are the ones that are caught up in the power play and the testosterone and the ego and the arrogance. And they're blocked. And I think that is a lot of work that we have to do as a movement. Those of us who want change need to understand how we transform ourselves and others at the same time who may not be on the same wavelength as us. And that is where I think that, you know, the youth movement has to do that as well, because not all youth are aligned and have the integrity. Not all youth want to have the same pathway of change that all of you who are part of the 50% want, in the same way that not all leaders that I'm working with do. And if we can get more ingenious, I mean, I've mentioned several times, you know, Cambridge Analytica for good. Now, through social media, through the new platforms, how do we bring back that integrity? How do we bring back that love and that respect that just seems to constantly get thrown out because all we see is people trashing each other and anger to the point of bullying and hate crimes, etc. So it is a deep shift in mindset, but I do think that if we all show up with our own integrity, and love thy neighbor in whatever language, in whatever religion we want to practice it, then hopefully we can, communicate that continuously and try to unpack all that tension, that pain, that anger that everybody has. And maybe one last point, I do believe that using COVID and the deep poly-crisis that we're in and the inflationary impact on so many young people, I really do think this is the moment to tap into that subconsciousness of going back to what is so essential. What brings us real satisfaction? What makes us happy? What makes us thrive? Thank you for your great question.
Thank you very much for your great answer.
Josefina, will you go ahead, please?
Thanks, Matthias, and thank you for everything that's been said so far. I mean, I couldn't agree more with everything that you guys are saying. And I related it to something to one of the slides that said redefining incentives, because I feel like if the youth were to perceive that there would be a receptivity to what we would like to say or we would like to see, if we feel like there's going to be someone on the other side that's really going to take responsibility for it, I feel like that would create an incentive for those who want to participate. But I just had a question about, because I was really interested in the systems, in the leadership compass, in the transformational leadership compass. So in all of this mess that we're in, I guess, and all the challenges that, like you were saying, are reinforcing and just have a very, very wide range of causes, where do you think this cycle of who comes first, of whether it's the youth that approaches or the ones in power that invite people in, like where would you begin? Where would the compass point, I guess, as a first step?
Yeah, so let me just give a bit of a little bit more insight on the compass. So, we had both a European compass, and then we said to Europe, and this is a compass that was produced for policymakers. So just to be very clear, right? Because we realized that what was happening was there was all these messages and echoes of value-based decision-making, and there's a lot of talk around that, but no one had started to unpack what it really means in practice across the entire compass. So how do you integrate that into leadership? How do you integrate that into value-based incentives? How do you integrate that into trade? I mean, so that's why we came up with the 10 principles. And we unpacked each of them, and I can also, I'll send you a link as well. It's on the website. It's on the Club of Rome website. There's both the European and then there's the international. Once we had done, because we were getting increasingly pissed off, some of us, with the way in which a lot of the policymakers at the European level talk about, yes, we've got the greatest social and environmental policy, but it's not transformative and it's not really changing things. So we thought if we started with this compass and then really brought all that thinking into discussions with policymakers continuously, and we're now running workshops through the European Union, and we want to do the same elsewhere. With others, of course, hand over the tool and let others use it in whatever way they need to in order to have convincing conversations. Then we were able to really start to see an influence at the European level, but we realized as we started to unpack this, there was a big missing link. And that is how are European policies influencing the rest of the world? And what does that look like when you move towards supposedly a Green Deal or a social deal? What does that mean in terms of trade? What does that mean in terms of barriers to trade? What does that mean in terms of impacts on people's lives and livelihoods in Mexico or in the Congo or anywhere else? And so that became a really interesting conversation, and where we started talking about material dependencies, etc. Within that, we have not brought as much the intergenerational voice, because it's been mostly a focus on the policy structures are broken. And this is where I think the complexity comes in when you start to look at transformational change. On the one hand, there are the different voices and the different actors, and how do you bring them in? On the other hand, they're the frameworks and the structures that exist. And we have a constant tension also within the Club of Rome on this very point. You know, do you still engage with the existing structures and try to change them because what's happening is disastrous in many ways? I mean, there are decisions that are being made daily that are the wrong decisions. So how do you inject compass thinking right now when we're trying to stop, for example, gas being and oil being used in Europe, stop our dependency on Russia, ensure that actually we become less climate vulnerable, et cetera, et cetera? What does that look like? And I think you need to do both. I mean, I've always been a proponent of you have to catalyze change within the existing systems to get to the next point, which is a total transformation. And there are examples of that, like when you start having value-based criteria, you realize that the existing systems don't function with value-based criteria. But if policymakers say, we want to adopt value-based criteria, then you can come in and say, okay, but the structure is totally screwed up. You need to rethink the structure. So let's co-design that structure. If you come in instead and say, your structure is totally screwed up, buddy, totally rethink it now, he'll come back, it's usually a him, and he's usually 60, and he's usually white, and he'll come back and say, it's going to take me 20 years to do that. Instead, say, hey, you just said that you really wanted this new criteria, but your structure won't support it. So let's move in a different space in order to shift your structure. And that's where I think smart new voices need to come in, because I can go in there and start shifting the structures. I need then the youth to come in and say, yes, this is the vision of the future that we want. And we want to work with you to co-create that.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Teodorina, please go ahead.
Hello, and thank you. A really very, very interesting presentation. Also, already quite energetic discussion with a lot of interesting ideas being flashed. And specifically, thank you, Sandrine, for continuing this presentation with the deep analysis and giving quite thoughtful answers to the challenging questions. I would like again to bring back a focus on the youth and how to trigger this transformative thinking through the different levels of system engagement where youth are present or need to be present. My recent focus as a consultant in sustainability and system transformation has been on educational systems, and especially in countries in Africa, in Asia, in China, and of course, in collaboration with the networks of very advanced, developed European and American universities. There is a lot of tension. There is a lot of misunderstanding and growing, actually, negativism, especially in the countries of the South, so-called South, and willingness and really looking for ways to discover America, to invent new rules, something that really will work because the system over there is completely dysfunctional. So back to my question, I will try to be a simple one. Your advice, first, are the educational institutions and systems involved in the processes you have described in your presentation, how they're involved? And let's move further. What is the role of the educational institutions in this transformational work? What are the first steps that immediately need to be taken for this leadership development and mindset transformation to start happening in the educational systems themselves, in the educational institutions, but even more important, they to trigger it in the students. And I'm not talking only about higher education. As you mentioned, youth from the smallest to, I mean, we learn all our lives. So how really to use this element in your plan, and very practical, the immediate steps. Thank you.
So, I mean, I think, and you probably know this already, it does start with national programs, educational programs, and how you build the programs. And a lot of that, I would say also, is not just teaching the environment or teaching certain types. I mean, obviously in Europe, because that's where I sit, you have the classics, but I think you have them everywhere, where in particular, all the way through to year 12, you're constantly mostly being taught maths and the humanities, but history, and in some cases very badly in most schools. So we need to totally rethink the educational system and come up with a program. And I know UNESCO is very much looking at this, and obviously Mampella and Carlos and Nolita and the work that's happening through NC and the Learning Planet and all the work that we're trying to do as well in shifting the educational system is fundamental. So one is, how do you recreate the programs and make them a priority program for the planet and for people in this day and age, in order to ensure that you educate in a very different way? Because it's not only just the programs, but it's the way in which kids and youth are educated in so many of these classical universities and classical programs. I mean, again, I see Valentine. I mean, we are in Belgium. Belgium has some of the most classical French kind of neoliberal type of programs that are being given to kids, and incredibly tough. By the way, there's also a psychological element here. I mean, in addition to the program itself, in so many countries, education is not about making a person a better person. And in Belgium, the flunk rate, so the number of kids that flunk out of even primary school, but high school is the worst, is up to 30% in some of the classes. And that is just creating a failure syndrome that then we get back to integrity, right? I mean, makes people pretty much not want to be either interested in continuing to be educated. And Theo, I will never forget the conversation we had around education, because I remember your real pushback around what was happening around your university. But it just, we don't reflect the way in which you should be human beings again. We don't reflect the way in which young children, all the way through the youth, can deal with the complexities and the anxiety that's hitting them today. It's a totally different world. And yet we have these classical studies. So that would be one. But the other, and this is where I am working on this very topic in terms of the economic and societal impacts of research and innovation. What we saw through COVID and the universities, and the role of universities during COVID, was almost as much about supporting students and supporting the youth rather than so-called educating the youth. And if you talk to provosts now, and this is why I'm saying this is the moment to tap into the subconsciousness. We need to use the narrative and the messaging of, we've just come out of the greatest crisis. It will continue. We will have more. We will be living through periods of chaos. Planning through chaos is a hell of a lot more difficult than planning upstream of chaos. So can we please start to think about how we create educational sanctuaries that not only create the vision of the future that we need, the leaders of the future that we need, but are also places where students and young people feel comfortable, where they're supported through this period of great angst. And that is really fundamental. And we see it also going all the way down to primary students. So the educators need to become human again, not math teachers that are slamming your hand because you've got the wrong formula. but actually realizing that maths is about solving some of the problems that are so deep and creating innovators of the future and entrepreneurs of the future. So yeah, I mean, I think this conversation needs to happen at a variety of different levels. It needs to happen at the national level, where we push for very new programs. It needs to happen through horizontal areas, like in our case, we've got the missions and Horizon research funding and the way in which universities are integrated in thinking through the future, at least at the European level. And that's part of what we're doing. We have to totally change the engagement between universities, research, and the vision of the future. And I think if we do that, then people like Theo and others will want to go back to university, be active in university, and continue to learn, because it's a real learning experience. Last point on primary school, which is something that has always baffled me. Belgium is, for all the criticism I have around the educational system, one of the only countries that I know of that offers all religions, including morality, to primary school students. And I actually believe that's fundamental, because what does it do? It brings back, coming back to integrity, it brings back that whole question of how do you become a moral, humane human being again? And you learn the same things, the same values across all the religions, no matter which religion you choose as a child. And I think that is also fundamental, because that starts the whole process.
Thank you.
You're
A
very
good
welcome.
start of a long conversation.
Yes, I hope we can continue this conversation. I would love to.
I would love to. I would love to. And I'm connected to many so-called Christian and other religions, Buddhist universities, where it looks like they're much ahead in the thinking in this direction.
Yeah, well, and Plum Village, and there's so many others that are doing such incredible work.
Yes, quite interesting. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Adriana, please.
Thank you so much, Sandrine, and all the team that organized this conversation. I'm super happy of being here, and everything resonates with me. I have been following Thich Nhat Hanh, and his books are amazing. And this change of humanity, I was so lucky to have Kate Raworth as my professor in my master's degree that I just finished.
Wow!
Yeah, and it was so fulfilling having her and feeling her energy, connecting with her ideas. And I come from a global South country. I'm from Peru, and it's nice to see people from Latin America here as well. And I was struck about this new paradigm of how we create this regenerative economy to make people thrive, and also the planet at the same time, realizing about this interconnection with the natural environment. And now, after I finished my master's, I'm in a position that I want to actually have an impact in my region based on these all new paradigms that I have been exposed during my master's, having Kate as a professor. So I don't know if within this international compass, how you can see this can be applicable for a global South country where there is no even will to implement changes that can be systematic. There's no system thinking, there's no capacity building. So now I'm like overwhelmed about everything, because I know that these ideas can sound well for a European country, and I understand why these are something that started with Europe. But at the same time, I think in the global South, we need more of these to not commit the same mistakes of global North countries. So my question is, where do you think we can start?
Yeah, we need a Latin American compass, Sharon. I agree. And we've talked to Nolita as well, and you know, how we can actually transform this into something that makes sense in Africa. I mean, it's all about sense making, because clearly the questions we're asking ourselves sometimes are the same, but they're coming from a very different perspective and different approach. And so it has to be embedded in the Latin American culture, and even in the country's culture. It has to be tailor-made to that country. one thing that I would say, Adriana, is that, value-based decision-making is in many cases indigenous thinking. And probably what resonates the most in Latin America is to come back to the roots of indigenous thinking. So maybe basing some systems compass thinking around indigenous knowledge could be one way. Now, clearly, as you have been very honest, not all countries are ready, first of all, to appreciate nor to accept, unfortunately, in Latin America, because of colonialism and because of the way in which the new regimes are following a very colonial pattern. Many of them are not willing to think through then what this means from an indigenous perspective and to come back to the roots of that country. But I do think that what's happening is because of the polycrisis, even the most stubborn idiots are rethinking because they're forced to. Now, there is a lot of arrogance everywhere in the world, and you do get leadership that's just turning a blind eye to all of the impacts. But if you look, for example, at the Pakistani leadership, which really before the incredible floods was not as open to a real shift in their economic model, was not as open to rethinking its political model or its social model and looking at inequity and poverty. Post the floods and post all the issues that they've had, it has opened up a totally new way. And it's sad, right? It's sad that we have to be hit with these catastrophes to wake up as human beings, rather than to plan and to be, thoughtful beforehand. But it is what it is, unfortunately. And so, this shift can happen, and it will happen more and more, because leaders are being forced to think through disaster much more than they ever were before, whether it be conflict, and some of them have had conflict forever, but now it's being compounded by climate effects, or it's being compounded by the pandemic. And so I think that all of these factors are actually, because what's happening is the trigger mechanism in their brain is, hold on, holy shit, I didn't think that this little microbe, this little virus thing that was in China could have such a devastating impact. Already just that realization makes you realize that you're as vulnerable as the most vulnerable link. You got to be pretty damn stupid or ignorant or stubborn not to make that link. Now, once you've made that link, you've opened up a window in that person's brain, which means actually we're all integrated. Hello, time to wake up. Yeah, we are all part of the same planet. And something that happens way over there is going to come and haunt us over here. And it doesn't matter how many cars we have. It doesn't matter whether we bunker ourselves in a mansion. At the end of the day, when we open that door and we have to go outside, we're still hit by the same impacts, granted at different levels, but we are still hit by those same impacts. So I think that what I'm trying to say is, even those leaders that we think are not open to this are being forced to smell the roses. They're being forced to realize that the more we have planetary effects, the more actually we're going to have poverty. The more we have poverty, and it's a constant feedback loop, the more we're going to have disruption. The more we're going to have disruption, oh, maybe I won't get reelected next time. Now, either you become an autocratic ruler and you don't give a shit, which in some cases, unfortunately, they don't, or all of a sudden you start to realize, hold on, actually, I need to take care of my people and I need to take care of my planet. So what are those trigger mechanisms that will enable those leaders to start to think that way? For us, that's what the compass was. Your compass could be different, but it could grab at least some of the thinking and then transform it into what resonates in your country, in Peru, or what resonates somewhere else. And then the systems thinking immediately comes in, because everybody knows, or most leaders are now struggling with a polycrisis. And most leaders are starting to realize that value chain disruption is creating huge problems across the globe because of this polycrisis, which means they're interdependent. So anyway, that was a long-winded answer. I hope it was useful, but it starts to allow us all to think again beyond the usual kind of linear approaches into what is it that people that is hitting people today, and how they're actually in their lives starting to think more systemically. I know we have 8 more minutes or 9 more minutes.
Thank you so much, Sandrine. Yeah, I think we should take that as a broad approach and then try to downscale according to the context.
And coming back to a regenerative economy, I mean, let's think through how that works. Even the most arrogant farmers, most of them who are lovely people, and their arrogance comes from a stubbornness because they think that they always, and some of them actually know that what they're doing is not necessarily the right way, but they've been coerced, let's just say, into industrial agriculture because they thought that that was the only way to survive. And it is a coercion, and it's really pathetic and horrible. But if you look at the way in which regenerative agriculture has really grown across the globe, it has come from an understanding that soils are becoming increasingly depleted. And that, again, the climate effects are making it even worse. So even in the US, in the middle of Kentucky, you know, in places where you wouldn't think that these big farming communities would shift, they're shifting because what they realize is actually that their soil is no longer bearing the crops that they need. And so again, we have to be creative in the way in which we bring forward and we engage with this, because we realize that most people are really starting to want to look at something different, but they don't know how. And then when we go to the next stage, we need to make sure those of us that are being able to influence policy, that we give them then the right incentives, the right frameworks to be able to produce and thrive in a new economy, which is really looking at broader well-being. And you can see that's happening now in Egypt. I mean, there's some unbelievable programs, and I'm happy to send you some of that around, you know, regenerative economies start with regenerative agriculture often, because there's more on that than there is in other areas. But I'm happy to continue that conversation as well, because it's really fascinating. And Kate is doing such beautiful work. She's just incredible through local communities, etc.
Yeah, that's true. She inspired me a lot, and I think she's trying also to downscale her model in Chile, in one city there.
Yeah.
So that helps a lot to have new ideas on global South countries.
Yeah, and actually we are part, and I've been leading our work on food and the Food Forward Consortium, and we're working with C40 in different cities across the globe on this approach as well.
Okay, so we have just 2 more to go. Nolita, please.
I'll keep it short, and I won't make it a question because I don't think we have time for an answer. So I'm going to make it a broad statement, hoping that we'll get a chance to have another conversation at some point. On what you mentioned about voting as the opportunity, in one of your slides, you said you mentioned 2030 being like a significant time. Which then makes it like for in places like South Africa, meaning that there's actually about 1 or maybe 2 elections between now and then. So I am a little bit conscious of how much transformation can happen over 2 elections, because, you know, it's a challenge to create that type of change, but not impossible. And then I'm going to circle back to what Samuel said about what do we expect youth to be able to do. And in the things that I've learned, and also I'm seeing in some of the work that you've written before, and some of the things that also the Club of Rome has been working on, speaking of maintenance learning versus innovative learning, and maintenance learning being the learning where we maintain the structures and we learn the things that are of the conditions of our society as it is today. And then innovative learning typically is what happens at the face of crises. And we're facing a lot of crises. So maybe then the opportunity as young people is, because for us, most often, this is the first time we're experiencing something like this, our capacity for innovative learning is very high. The intergenerational dialogue then becomes important because sometimes you're innovating, but you're actually talking about something that has been tried before. So maybe when we speak about this conversation of learning and competencies, the opportunity could be there. On having people with competencies involved in the conversation, one of the things I struggle with is like, how is competency built? How is the competency to have a conversation on a global stage built? It is built by someone taking a chance on you and having you in the conversation. Otherwise, you cannot do it in your local context. Then no one believes in your validity to be at a UN conversation about XYZ. But then also the process of helping someone build the competency to be in a COP discussion, etc. What has happened is we've created celebrities of young people because at this type of knowledge self-reinforces, and then we continue to trust in the same people. So what type of intergenerational dialogue, what type of processes can we make so that this is more diversified and it is not just, again, reinforcing a system where we pick a handful few that we believe have opinions to contribute, because it just exacerbates global inequalities where we have a handful of Africans, Latin Americans, Asians in these conversations, a wide range of young Europeans involved in these conversations, way more than the global South. The representation of young Europeans in these conversations is so much more than what is 80% of the population, that it seems like it's reinforcing these things. But as again, it's not going to be a question because we don't have time for an answer. But thank you so much for this, because I've learned a lot.
Thank you, Nolita. And maybe just a couple of thoughts, though, as we move. Maybe it can make for a second engagement, which I would really welcome, because I think we're all trying to get through these complexities. And as I said, you know, these intergenerational dialogues are so fundamental. 2030 is a decade of action with regard to climate change, because we know we have to reverse the spiral. And so that's why we often talk about 2030. You're right. I mean, there are elections in many countries, many elections, and we're seeing now, for example, the step down of Jacinda Ardern and also of Nicola Sturgeon could create problems with regard to the well-being economy model that's been put in both countries. And so those of us who are working in that area are really trying hard right now to make sure that actually that model stays intact, no matter what political system is in place and no matter what election is in place. And that comes into a broader discussion that we should have on governance and how you actually make sure that decisions aren't just politicized, but that you create the governance frameworks that enable you to continue in the good ancestor thinking for many, 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 many centuries. Of course, we can't say centuries, but at least many, many years and different election cycles. So that would be one. I love, yes, fully agree with the capacity for innovative thinking and the fact that it's high. This is a moment, absolutely, to shake up systems, to totally transform systems. If we want to do it in the next 7 years, then often it's finding those catalysts, those levers that really are going to create that transformational change. And your last reflection on more Europeans, you know what I've been seeing more and more, and what we saw at COP at least, that the youth hub at COP and the resilience hub, where we work together, of course, also on the youth resilience hub creation, but the youth hub itself had an unbelievable diversity of young people from all over the world. The first time I've ever seen it. And I agree with you that we've kind of institutionalized a few voices, but what the discussion is now is how do we make sure that all of those incredible voices, first of all, that they can attend. And by the way, this is the same problem for the delegations in the small and medium income countries that basically can't even send people to attend these high-level negotiations or have 1 to 2 delegates. So it's not just a youth problem, it's also just an overarching problem of not being able to have your voice or your delegates actually there. So there's a whole funding issue, and that's another conversation that we should probably have. But I fully agree with your points, and I think that we need to think through this. And so let's continue this conversation. And I apologize, I don't know if you guys can hear the puppy barking in the background, but my dog is going ballistic. So I'm gonna go down and let her out.
Well, okay, Sandrine, just to make a small comment, because at some point you talked about education and how education should be once again on how to teach people how to be better people, or how to teach a person how to be a better person. There's a project in which we've been working for the past year or so, in a discussion that actually started with Manfela's Intergen session. We talked with you about it in Costa Rica. We talked with Didi and Carlos also, and it's the School of Citizenship that we have started in the past year, and it talks about how to actually build a citizenship of virtue, because we consider that virtues are beyond values, because values are like they depend on the context, they depend on the cultural mindset, on the economics, on the social mindset. Right now, most of the values that this world has are related to capitalism and the way in which capitalism produces. So we think that there's something deeper to go in. Actually, in ancient Greece, education was education of virtues, the education of the person on how to be the best person possible. And that's something that we believe that needs to be recovered. It's something that has been a part of the conversation that we had with all the team in the past few weeks, and that we're pretty much looking forward to keep discussing. I'm saying this because we would love to include everyone in this call, even the people that has already left, in this kind of conversations soon enough. We have a lot to think about. We want to thank you deeply because you have left our minds blown away with ideas and motivation, inspiration. And we have a lot of challenges ahead of ourselves, a lot to think about, but also a lot to talk about, and especially how to shift from intergenerational dialogue to intergenerational action in the short term rather than the mid.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Matthias, and I really look forward to moving through this process of the citizenship of virtue, and the way in which we can move forward. And there is so much that we can do together. So, and not only just having these dialogues, definitely passing into action, but also just mutually supporting each other, because it is tough. And I think that it's very painful for many of us. You know, we fluctuate between obviously despair and optimism every day. And the more we can talk to each other, with each other, learn from each other, and then build those bridges towards a beautiful future that I still believe is possible if we can all become human again, then we'll get there slowly but surely. Thank you again for everything that the 50% does. It's really fabulous.
Thank you. Thank you very much,
everyone.
And everyone in this call.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.